So let's now move on to look at proteins. Proteins constitute about 12 to 15% of our total body mass. About 65% of that is in skeletal muscle. No other class of biomolecules has such a broad variety of functions. So they're involved in muscle contraction, obviously, because they're so prevalent in skeletal muscle. They're also involved in the motility of cells using cilia and flagella. And they're also major structural components. As you know, all cell membranes are riddled with proteins. They have receptors, pumps, ion channels, and then cell identity markers. There's also a lot of fibrous proteins we've looked at: collagen, elastin, keratin, and it makes up much of the structure of bone. We see proteins in cartilage, in tendons, in ligaments, in skin, in hair, and in nails. There's also a huge family of globular proteins that form the antibodies and hormones, myoglobin, many neuromodulators, hemoglobin, and then there are about 2,000 enzymes that control nearly every aspect of cellular metabolism. All of those are proteins. There are also plasma proteins, albumins, and other proteins that maintain blood viscosity and the osmolarity. There's also proteins involved in transporting lipids and some of the other plasma solutes. Proteins act to buffer the pH of body fluids, and they also contribute to the resting membrane potential of cells. So how much protein do we really need? Now, the recommended daily allowance is about 44 to 60 grams a day. That's for the average person. But if you take your weight in pounds and multiply it by 0.37, that gives you an estimate of your recommended daily allowance for protein. Higher intakes recommended under conditions of stress, because we're breaking down proteins and we need to build new ones to replace them. In the case of infection, for the same reasons, and injury, and pregnancy, because there's a whole nother individual growing that needs to be built from proteins. Excessive intake overloads the kidneys with nitrogenous waste and can cause kidney damage. This is why some of those high protein diets, low carbohydrates, are very dangerous. Not only do you need the intermediaries of carbohydrates to digest some of the fats, but we're also putting an extreme challenge on our kidneys. The nutritional value of a protein really depends on it having the right proportions of amino acids. There are 20 amino acids total. 12 of them are inessential amino acids, meaning they're synthesized by the body if the diet doesn't supply them. 8 amino acids are essential amino acids, so they cannot be synthesized by the body. These amino acids are isoleucine, leucine, lysine, methionine, phenylalanine, threonine, tryptophan, and valine. Cells don't store any surplus amino acids for later use. So when proteins need to be synthesized, all the amino acids that are needed for that protein need to be right there at that time. If one's missing, the protein can't be synthesized. So it's very, very important to have all 20 amino acids present in the right sorts of proportions. Complete proteins are high-quality dietary proteins that are going to provide all the essential amino acids in the right proportions for human tissue growth and for the maintenance and nitrogen balance. Incomplete proteins are low quality because they lack one or more of the essential amino acids. So net protein utilization is a term that concerns the percentage of amino acids in a protein that the human body uses. So animal proteins will use about 70 to 90% of the amino acids in a steak to produce our own proteins. And we'll only use about 40 to 70% of plant proteins. So in order to mix the incomplete plant proteins and get the right amino acids in the right time frame, you'd have to eat almost a pound of rice and beans to provide the same amount of usable protein as just 4 ounces of hamburger. So if you have very high protein demands, then a vegetarian diet requires you to eat a huge amount of calories in order to get the essential protein. There are advantages to decreasing meat intake, of course, and increasing the plant intake. There's many more vitamins and minerals and fiber in plant material. There's much less saturated fat, so we can lower cholesterol. There's no cholesterol to be taken in, and there's less pesticide. So how should we acquire all this protein that we need? First of all, animal proteins are complete proteins, so meat, eggs, and dairy products. And they closely match the ratios of amino acids that we see in human proteins. Plant sources are incomplete proteins, so they have to be combined in the right proportions in order to be beneficial. This is why in a vegetarian diet, one needs to be very careful about which sources are being consumed. And the sources should be consumed at the same time so that the amino acids cross into our cells together and that we can build complete proteins. So grains combined with legumes will provide a complete protein. So beans and rice are a great complementary choice. So now a little look at nitrogen balance. When nitrogen is in balance, the rate of nitrogen ingestion equals the rate of nitrogen that we excrete. Proteins are the major dietary source of nitrogen. And so if it's being excreted, that means we're breaking down proteins. And if it is being held onto, then we're building proteins. So positive nitrogen balance is when we see that there is more ingested than there is excreted, which means that we're retaining protein for tissue growth. We'll see a positive nitrogen balance in pregnant women and athletes who are involved in resistance training and need to build a lot of protein. Negative nitrogen balance results when the excretion of nitrogen exceeds the ingestion of nitrogen in protein. This means that body proteins are being broken down for fuel, usually results in muscle atrophy, and usually only happens in cases of starvation or protein deficiency. The muscles and liver proteins are the most easily broken down, and they're only broken down when carbohydrate and fat intake is insufficient to meet the body's energy needs. So in the case of starvation, we're not getting enough other nutrients. We're not getting enough of our standard fuels, so we start to digest our own proteins, and we'll see a lot of nitrogenous waste in the feces. Also, if we're not ingesting enough protein to make the proteins that we need for our own functioning, then we'll begin to break down our own muscle fibers in order to release those proteins to make enough of the metabolic proteins that we need. Glucocorticoids are going to promote protein catabolism. This is why stress, remember cortisol, is released in states of stress, causes protein breakdown. We'll see growth hormone and sex steroids promote protein synthesis and a positive nitrogen balance. And this happens a lot during childhood and then adolescence, where we see growth spurts, and it's necessary to incorporate more protein. So finally, we'll take a look at vitamins and minerals. Minerals are inorganic elements that plants extract from the soil or water and introduce them into the food web. Vitamins are small dietary organic compounds that are necessary for metabolism. Neither vitamins or minerals are used as fuel, but both are essential to our ability to use other nutrients. Minerals constitute about 4% of the body mass. Of course, 3/4 of that is going to be in calcium and phosphorus that we see in the bones and teeth. Phosphorus is also a structural component of phospholipids. ATP, cyclic AMP, GTP, and creatine phosphate, anything that involves phosphate. And it's also the basis for the phosphate buffer system. we'll see that calcium, iron, magnesium, and manganese all function as cofactors for enzymes. So they help enzymes and metabolic processes move electrons from one place to another. Iron is a mineral that's essential for the oxygen carrying capacity of hemoglobin and myoglobin. We'll also see chlorine, of course, as a component of hydrochloric acid that we see in stomach acid. Many of our mineral salts function as electrolytes and govern the function of nerve and muscle cells because they osmotically regulate the content and distribution of water in the body, and they maintain blood volume as well as resting membrane potentials. Plants are going to be the best source of minerals because they extract them directly from the earth. Now, we'll find these minerals in vegetables, legumes, milk, eggs, fish, and shellfish. Animal tissues contain a large amount of salt, so carnivores rarely lack salt in their diets. However, herbivores often supplement by ingesting salt from the soil. Salt actually was a currency at one point in time and has often been used as a form of payment for goods and services. The word salary comes from sal, as in salt. So our fondness for salt and our high sensitivity to it has undoubtedly come from its physiological importance and its scarcity in a largely vegetarian diet. Now, this fondness has created some problems for us because our recommended sodium intake is only about 1.1 gram per day. However, the typical American diet contains about 4.5 grams per day, especially when we consider processed foods, maybe even more. And of course, excess salt leads to hypertension. Now, of course, if you sweat a lot every day, then you're losing a lot of salt, and so it's not so much of an issue. Most vitamins are going to be obtained from our diet also. The body synthesizes some vitamins from precursors called provitamins, like niacin comes from the amino acid tryptophan, and vitamin A from carotene, which we find in a lot of orange-colored vegetables. Vitamin D, we know already, comes from cholesterol. Vitamin K, pantothenic acid, biotin, and folic acid are produced by bacteria in the large intestine. And so there's actually more of those in feces than there is in the food that we ingest. Water-soluble vitamins are C and B complex, and they're absorbed with water in the small intestine. And they're quickly excreted by the kidneys, they're not stored, and they seldom accumulate to excess. Even if you consume hundreds of times the recommended dose, they'll simply be excreted in urine. So these vitamins were all named in the order that they were discovered. A, B, C. They also have regular names. So vitamin C is ascorbic acid. It promotes hemoglobin synthesis, collagen synthesis, and sound connective tissue structure. It's an antioxidant, and so it scavenges free radicals and possibly reduces the risk of cancer. As you probably know, if you're feeling sort of like you might be getting sick, large doses of vitamin C can also help the immune system function. B vitamins function as coenzymes or parts of coenzyme molecules. Again, coenzymes often assist in transferring electrons from one metabolic reaction to another, and it'll make it possible for enzymes to catalyze these reactions. Now the fat-soluble vitamins. Fat-soluble vitamins are incorporated into the lipid micelles that we see in the small intestine and are absorbed with dietary lipids. We have vitamin A, which is a big component of visual pigments, and it promotes proteoglycan synthesis and epithelial maintenance. Vitamin D, as we know, promotes calcium absorption and bone mineralization. Vitamin K, very important for prothrombin synthesis, which is involved in blood clotting. And vitamins A and E are also antioxidants like ascorbic acid. It's common knowledge that a lot of diseases result from vitamin deficiencies, but not so common that they result from excesses. Hypervitaminosis is vitamin excess. So, for example, if we look at vitamin A, if there's a deficiency, we'll see night blindness, dry skin and hair, dry conjunctiva and cloudy cornea in the eyes, and increased incidence of urinary, digestive, and respiratory infections. Vitamin A is the world's most common vitamin deficiency. However, being a fat-soluble vitamin, it remains stored in fat and thus can accumulate to excess. In excess, it causes anorexia, nausea and vomiting, headache, pain, very fragile bones, lots of hair loss, enlarged liver and spleen, and certainly birth defects. So it just goes to show, again, everything in balance, in moderation. Vitamins B6, C, D, and E have also been implicated in toxic hypervitaminosis. That brings up the idea of megavitamins. Megavitamins are doses 10 to 1,000 times the recommended daily allowance. Sometimes people take these to improve athletic performance. But since vitamins are not burned as fuel, and only very small amounts are necessary to fully meet the body's metabolic needs, there's no evidence that the vitamins will improve performance, except, of course, if there's a deficit in that vitamin to begin with. Here's a table of all the water-soluble vitamins, the fat-soluble vitamins, and their various functions. Go ahead and close your books and close your notes. And let's see how much you can recall. Write down as many vitamins as you can. Categorize them into water-soluble and fat-soluble. And then see if you can remember some of their functions. If you can't, that's okay. You can flip open your books, check it out, and see if you can fill in the gaps. Also, see how much you can write down about proteins. Just as much as you remember. Brainstorm, recall, and then look back. Check it out, fill in the gaps. So that finishes the first section of this chapter. Next, we'll move on to carbohydrate metabolism.